It's hard to be regal when the fires have gone out. The grand hearth in the great watching chamber refuses to catch fire. The queen is cold, her underclothes soaked through. Perhaps it's all a metaphor for the state of her kingdom. Once so bright, now dimmed. No, not just dimmed, darkened. The last rays of sunlight slants through the windows and falls across the queen's bed where she lies. Or perhaps she doesn't lie. It's hard to tell sometimes. When did she go down? When did she stop standing? The court waits for her to die. And in this twilight moment, they wonder if she even knows they're waiting. If she even knows anything at all. Was she always like this, or was this how it started? How did she get here? The details matter less than the truth. Truth she knew was a dangerous thing, a weapon, a shield, a currency, and for 45 years she wielded it expertly. Once, she declared, "My first and most real act was a declaration. My blood and my crown are one." Her identity was forged in that moment, and she lived up to it. She shaped England's destiny. She survived assassination attempts and rebellions. She navigated religious upheaval and foreign wars. Yet somewhere along that path, she made enemies. Not just the usual rogues and royals, but something more permanent, more inescapable. And now as she fades, they're coming for her, and she knows it. The walls are closing in. She hears drums. She smells gunsmoke. Faces leer at her from the shadows. Ghosts, apparitions, hallucinations. What does it matter? They're all she sees. She sees Mary in the corner, her cousin, begging for mercy. Beside her, the Earl of Essex, his head drooping, his eyes dull. Then another, and another. The Spanish Armada, the slaughtered Protestants, the men and women she had sentenced to death, all for crimes real and imagined. And then they're all gone, vanished like wisps of smoke, leaving her alone in the darkness, shivering, whispering. The Queen of England has lost her court, her country, her mind. There's no ceremony now, no velvet cushions, no gold brocades, only a withered, crumpled form wrapped in damp linen. The grand Elizabeth, whose portraits once beamed down from every palace wall, who inspired art and poetry, who defied the odds and the expectations of her gender and time, ends not in triumph, but in tragedy. Her doctors, who have been fighting a losing battle against her illness, stand helpless. Her ministers gossip about the future, unaware of her fading presence in the room. Her ladies-in-waiting watch, torn between their duty and their horror at the Queen's disintegration. And as the first hints of dawn creep through the window, Elizabeth Tudor dies. When they turn her head, they find rigor mortis has set in. For hours, perhaps days, she has been dead, yet she has kept her secret close, escaping the world without taking it with her. The truth is, no one knows why she became that way. Why did she lose her mind's and body's control in the end? Was it the cumulative toll of 45 years of absolute rule? The crushing loneliness of never marrying? Of living and loving without ever fully being able to feel the sun on her skin, or the wind in her hair because of who she was, because of what she represented? Or was it something darker, something she carried from childhood? A wound that festered and grew until it overwhelmed her, consumed her, became her. And as they lay her out in her coffin, the court begins to whisper its own theories, rumors that will echo for centuries. Madness and Elizabeth become synonymous. But the truth is, she wasn't always mad. She could be charming, witty, charming, ruthless, all depending on which version of her reigns. And ultimately, it's the ghost of that earlier self, the young, vibrant princess who once seemed invincible, that haunts her grave. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of lilies and beeswax. Elizabeth's court had learned to fear silence, but now it was all that remained. Ministers crept like shadows through the halls, careful not to disturb the thick stillness that surrounded her. No one knew what to say anymore, and even those who had once basked in the warmth of her favor now spoke in hushed tones, not from respect, but out of deep, shivering unease. The Queen was no longer a ruler of presence and command. She was becoming a relic of something once divine, now decaying. Her long refusal to name a successor bred more tension with each passing hour. Her counselor Cecil Howard and others were torn between duty and fear, between preserving the dignity of their queen and preparing for the inevitable collapse of her reign. Yet still, Elizabeth refused to lie down. For 6 full days and nights, she stood, her thin legs trembling beneath layers of velvet and bone, refusing the bed that seemed to beckon her like a grave. Her ladies-in-waiting tried to persuade her, even begged her, tears in their eyes, voices trembling, but she pushed them away with a stare that pierced like frost. Must is not a word to be used to princes, she once said in her youth, and now, in the hour of death, she lived by it more fiercely than ever. But her body, the once commanding vessel of a nation's power, could not obey her will forever. Her feet swelled, her fingers shook, her heart beat with irregular rhythm, too slow one moment, too fast the next. Her lips cracked beneath the weight of white lead, and beneath her eyes bloomed the deep purple shadows of insomnia and despair. Still, she stood, until she couldn't. Her knees gave way beneath her and she collapsed silently into the arms of a servant. No scream, no cry, just surrender. They carried her finally, to the bed she had refused, laying her down upon stiff royal sheets as though placing a relic inside a coffin. Her eyes remained open, but they did not see. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. It was as if her soul hovered at the edge of her body, not willing to leave yet, not certain what waited beyond. Outside, the court trembled. England had known only her for 44 years. Entire generations had never known another ruler. To imagine a world without Elizabeth was to imagine the end of order itself. Some believed her death would spark civil war, that rivals for the throne would rise and tear the country apart. Others whispered that her death was a punishment, a final reckoning for the blood spilled during her long and turbulent reign. In corners of the palace, priests murmured prayers over candles that sputtered and dimmed in the March winds. And still, the queen lingered. They said she refused all food and drink, that her throat was parched, her stomach empty, yet she pushed away every offering with a twitch of her hand or a shake of her fading head. Physicians tried poultices, concoctions, even ancient remedies involving crushed pearls and rose oil, but nothing touched her decline. Her mind was no longer in the room. She had drifted somewhere between worlds. Some nights she moaned softly, words lost in breath, syllables warped beyond meaning. One lady swore she heard her whisper, "I am the shadow I feared," though no one else confirmed it. Another claimed she spoke Latin in a fevered trance, cursing and absolving her soul in the same breath. But whether these were truths or tales, one fact remained. Certain Elizabeth was not dying peacefully. She was struggling, as if dragged into death by unseen hands. And around her, those same shadows she once commanded began to consume the palace. Curtains were drawn tighter, candles burned lower. The courtiers dressed in darker clothes, preparing not only for mourning but for power shifts that would follow her last breath. Every footstep was muffled, every look held suspicion. Messengers traveled in secret to Scotland, where James waited for confirmation of the inevitable. But none could bring themselves to speak it aloud in the palace. Elizabeth was dying. And in her dying, a chapter of English history was collapsing. On the 6th night, as her breathing grew shallower, her ladies brought in her old ring, a symbol of her queenship, of her promise to remain married to her people alone. They slipped it onto her thin bony finger. It nearly fell off. The once glorious ring that gleamed in the sunlit courts of her prime now looked absurd against the corpse-like pallor of her hand. She did not react. Her eyes, sunken deep beneath waxy skin, flickered once toward the ceiling and then shut. A hush fell across the room. No one knew if she had gone. Then her chest rose again, slow, painful, forced. Not yet. Outside her chamber, the guards shifted uneasily. The wind screamed through the gaps in the stonework. Somewhere deep in the palace, a tapestry fell from the wall. An omen, a coincidence. None dared guess. The courtiers awaited the signal that had not yet come, the moment history would turn its page. And Elizabeth, England's longest-reigning monarch, hovered between life and legend. This is a new series called The Last. Each episode we bring you a new story of a famous person's final days, told by me. And this is the last of Elizabeth I. The sun rose on Richmond Palace, but no one opened the windows. Light was not welcome in those corridors where death hovered like incense. Elizabeth lay still, her frame barely making an impression in the bed that once cradled the most powerful woman in Europe. Yet, as her courtiers and physicians drew close to confirm what they already suspected, they were met not with finality but with persistence. She was still breathing, faint, staggered, but still. The queen clung to life like a ghost, refusing to pass. For hours, her chest rose and fell, each breath slower, each interval more dreadful. The silence was no longer respectful. It was unbearable. There was no dignity now, no majesty, just waiting for the inevitable. But death, it seemed, had its own patience. Elizabeth, even in her final ruin, would not surrender quickly. This too was a kind of power. A defiance, not in sword or decree, but in sheer endurance. She had ruled for 44 years, outlasted countless enemies, and built an empire on her name alone. If death thought it could take her easily, it was mistaken. Yet this was no victory. There was nothing glorious in it, only horror. Her attendants whispered prayers through their teeth, while others whispered speculation. Was this agony her punishment, her purgatory for the blood on her hands, the lives she had ordered extinguished? Or was this merely the consequence of a soul that had burned so brightly for so long it could not find its way to darkness? By the evening of the 7th day, her hands had curled into claws. Her skin, once powdered and perfumed for courtly charm, was yellowed, brittle, almost translucent. Her jaw hung open, and yet her eyes refused to close. A bishop attempted to speak to her, leaning close, murmuring rites and scripture. She did not react. But when he asked if she died in the faith of Christ, they swore she moved her lips. No sound, just movement, a nod, a farewell. The signal the court had waited for. Still, no one dared move. Until finally, the breath stopped. For real. The room held still for a heartbeat longer, then another, then too many. She did not inhale again. And then the realization passed like frost through every person present. The queen was dead. Elizabeth Tudor, monarch, warrior, icon, was no more. And yet, no one moved. It was not triumph, not grief. It was paralysis, as though the death of one woman had pulled the very gravity out of the room. But history has no time for mourning. Within minutes, the machine turned. Death was confirmed privately among her closest counselors, and even before the body cooled, A messenger was already on horseback, galloping towards Scotland. James would be king now. The Virgin Queen had died, and in her place would rise a man born of a beheaded woman. The irony was bitter, but the transition needed to appear seamless. Elizabeth had never named James in public, but she had nodded, they claimed. That was enough. It had to be. Because if not, all hell might follow. Still, the body had to be treated, prepared, preserved. Royal death was not a personal affair, it was political theater. Her remains were an artifact now, to be displayed, marched, mourned, and buried with symbolism thick as incense. Her ladies, trembling, began the work. They dressed her in the royal funeral shroud, combed her wig, reapplied her white makeup. They worked in silence, as though she might wake again and punish them. But she would not. The breath was truly gone. And yet, even in death, she retained a kind of power, her figure lying in state, watched day and night by guards who avoided her gaze. As word of her death spread, England itself seemed to hold its breath. Bells tolled, but not with triumph, more like warnings. Across the countryside, people wept, not just for a monarch, but for the end of something larger than a life, an era, a symbol, a queen who, despite all, had held a nation together through fire and blood, and now she was dust. Rumors blossomed like mold. Some said she died cursing the world. Others that she welcomed death with a lover's sigh. A few claimed her ghost remained in Richmond, forever pacing the cold floors, reliving her final sleepless nights. No one agreed. No one ever would, because the truth of a monarch's death is never one truth. It fractures, multiplies, festers. The funeral, when it came, was no ordinary ritual. It was a pageant of mourning. Black drapery hung from every visible stone. Priests dressed in solemn vestments. Nobles rode in silence, their eyes cast down, not from sorrow but fear. Because Elizabeth had ruled with such force that even in death she haunted them, every decision they made now would be judged against her legacy. Every whisper would echo her silence. And as her body was taken from Richmond to Westminster, the streets lined with peasants. All standing in dead quiet, they saw not a corpse but a memory of strength, of severity, of something they did not fully understand but knew they had lost. Her coffin was covered in purple velvet, the royal standard draped across it, and a wax effigy of her crowned figure placed atop. Soldiers marched, choirs sang, but the music could not dispel the chill, because beneath the finery lay a woman who had died alone, whispering to ghosts, refusing comfort. That image would not leave them. It would outlast every hymn, every salute, and in the hearts of those who remembered her, the tale of her final days would become more than legend. It would become a question. What does power give you when death comes? What legacy do you leave when the throne is empty, and the world you ruled moves on? And what they feared most was this, that no one, not even Gloriana, escaped the dark. They called her the Virgin Queen, but in death, Elizabeth I became something more spectral than sovereign, more symbol than soul. The legends began almost instantly, swelling in the gaps where facts ended and fear began. In taverns and manor houses they whispered that her body had turned cold days before the court admitted it, that her soul had hovered over the Thames, unwilling to cross, clinging to the dying embers of power. Others claimed that her face had hardened into something unnatural, her famed beauty, her mask of lead and rouge, cracking into a grotesque grimace, as if her body had refused peace, even in its final stillness. Yet these stories, morbid as they were, served a deeper purpose. They helped the people understand how someone so mighty, so revered, could fall into the arms of death, just like anyone else. And in that understanding they found something even more terrifying, that no crown, no icon, no divine right could protect you from the slow rot of the end. But Elizabeth's final performance wasn't quite over. As her body lay in state, the court was transformed into a theater of ritual and choreography. Mourning became a spectacle, measured tears, scripted lamentations, coordinated processions. The wax effigy they created of her, poised and regal, bore little resemblance to the ravaged figure that had wasted away in the weeks before. It wasn't just a tribute, it was propaganda, a necessary illusion to preserve the myth of Elizabeth the Eternal, even as her real form had crumbled into mortality. The effigy smiled with sculpted calm, while the corpse beneath the velvet rotted slowly in its royal casing. But the people didn't see the decay. They saw the pageantry, and they believed, because they needed to. For most of them, she had simply always been there. She had outlived popes, kings, revolutions. She had faced down assassins, plotted the deaths of traitors, and raised a crumbling kingdom into a European power. To imagine a world without her was to imagine a world without foundation. And beneath that grief lurked a deeper terror. What comes next? James VI of Scotland had already been declared her successor. He would become James I of England. And though the transition was peaceful in appearance, it carried the quiet tremor of a fault line. Elizabeth's courtiers, so long accustomed to her moods and methods, were now forced to reckon with a new ruler, new politics, new fears. Some adjusted, others were cast aside. And yet, none of them could forget the final weeks of Elizabeth's life, nor the dread that had soaked the palace walls. Even those loyal to James understood that they were walking across the bones of an empire forged by her will alone. But Elizabeth's legacy wasn't written in the stone of palaces or the ink of decrees. It was written in fear, in awe, in the strange, unsettling power she held over everyone around her. Even in illness, even in the slow unraveling of her mind, she ruled. No one dared question her. No one dared comfort her without permission. Her final refusal to name a successor publicly had not been stubbornness, it had been control. Her last act of dominion. She wanted the world to know that even death would not loosen her grip on the throne, that the crown would not pass until her breath had stopped, and in that, she succeeded. Some claim that Elizabeth knew exactly how her death would be remembered, that she orchestrated it with the same precision she used to command her realm. The long refusal to sleep, the muttering to ghosts, the public decline that blurred the line between woman and wraith. It was a story she authored in silence, a final drama in a life filled with performance, but others insist it was not control at all, that she was afraid, that beneath the layers of power and image, there was only a lonely, broken woman haunted by regret, by blood, by the absence of love. A queen who died as she lived, alone in a room full of people who could never truly know her. The truth lies somewhere in the shadow between those two visions, and perhaps that is why her final days are still so captivating. They are not just about death, they are about the collapse of myth, about what happens when a figure built of marble and fire is reduced to flesh and decay. And what we see, in that collapse, is not weakness but humanity, terrifying, raw, and real. The stone that sealed Elizabeth's tomb was thick and heavy and final, but it could unsmother the myths that had already begun to bloom in the silence she left behind. Even as the echoes of her funeral still hung in the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, her memory twisted itself into something far larger and far more terrifying than the woman who had once ruled. The world no longer saw her as merely a monarch. They saw her as a specter, a warning, a tragic emblem of power's final cost. In the months that followed her death, tales of her ghost wandering the halls of Richmond and Whitehall spread like rot through the court. Servants swore they heard her heels clicking against the flagstones long after nightfall, echoing in corridors no one dared enter alone. Some claimed she was searching for Essex, forever calling his name. Others said she simply paced, sleepless as ever, unable to rest even in death. James I, her successor, dismissed the stories in public, but he could not fully dispel the shadow she cast over his new reign. He inherited the throne, yes, but not the aura, not the fear, not the grip Elizabeth had held over her people. Every decision he made was silently compared to what Elizabeth would have done. Her policies, her resolve, even her cruelty became standards against which he was judged. In life she had dominated her court, in death she dominated memory, and that was perhaps her most unsettling legacy, the way she had transformed herself into an idea, something eternal, even as her body withered into dust. But those closest to her, those who had watched her final descent into madness and silence, knew the truth behind the legend. They remembered the trembling hands, the glassy eyes, the way her voice faltered and faded. They remembered the fear in her attendants' eyes as they begged her to sleep, the way she refused not out of pride, but terror. And above all, they remembered how she spoke to people who weren't there. Names long dead, accusations whispered into the air, regrets she would never admit aloud. These were not the markings of a deity. They were the unraveling of a woman who had spent too long wearing a crown too heavy for any mortal. And still, despite this intimate decay, the nation clung to the image of Gloriana, the queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, the sovereign who presided over Shakespeare, Raleigh and Drake, the ruler who never married, never bowed, never gave in. The contradiction was jarring and it made her more mythical still. She had been a woman who ruled like a man, but died with the frailty of every broken human heart. In that paradox, the public found something hauntingly beautiful and terrifying, because it meant that even the greatest among them were not spared the slow, humiliating crawl toward death. Years later, poets would immortalize her with flourishes of grandeur, painting her as a goddess in human form. Portraits commissioned posthumously depicted her with impossible youth, ageless skin, eyes filled with knowing fire. But beneath each stroke of paint was a desperate attempt to forget the truth, to erase the memory of her body collapsing inward, her eyes empty and searching, her refusal to eat, her skeletal fingers twitching under layers of silk, her lips stained with lead, her final words, if they were ever truly spoken, drowned in speculation and embellished with meaning. But the truth, as always, was darker, more human, more painful, and perhaps that's why her final days remain among the most terrifying chapters in English royal history, because they remind us that no amount of ceremony, no legacy of conquest or culture, no myth of virginity or divine favor, can protect the soul from itself. Elizabeth's death was not heroic. It was not even noble. It was slow. It was ugly. It was real. She died as she lived alone, misunderstood, surrounded by power but untouched by comfort. Even now, centuries later, visitors to Westminster Abbey pass her tomb and feel something shift in the air, a chill, a pressure, a silence that does not belong to the stones alone. Some say her eyes still linger there, watching the living with the same piercing gaze she once turned on traitors and lovers alike. Others believe her soul never left the palace walls, trapped in the liminal space between myth and mortality. And when the wind howls through old corridors and the candles flicker without warning, they say you can still hear the faint whisper of a queen who could not sleep, and never will. This is a period drama. And in today's episode, we are going to look at how the myth-making around the Virgin Queen began almost immediately after her death. Alright, let's get started. The weeks following Elizabeth's burial were not marked by peace, but by a persistent disquiet that no proclamation from the new king could silence. The people of England had not simply lost a monarch, they had lost a symbol, a presence, a force that for nearly half a century had defined the rhythm of the realm. And in the void she left behind, rumors grew like mold on damp stone. Even among those who had never seen her in life, her loss was palpable. In marketplaces, in chapels, in alleyways, the same questions circled in low tones. Had she died well? Had she repented? Was she truly at rest? Those closest to her knew the answers were far more disturbing, for they had seen the mask slip. The image of Elizabeth the Eternal, crowned, poised, serene, had been a fragile illusion in her final weeks, barely held together by powder and performance. What remained beneath that veneer was not the mighty lioness of England, but a withered woman trembling in the dark, too afraid to close her eyes, too proud to show weakness, and too haunted to find sleep. She had spent her life mastering image, wielding symbolism like a weapon, and yet, when the end came, none of it could shield her from the terrible intimacy of death. The courtiers who had once basked in her attention now spoke only in cautious tones about her final days. They rarely used her name, as though it might still summon her. In secret journals and coded letters, they hinted at what they had witnessed: the sleepless pacing, the vacant stares, the whispered names of the dead. Some feared that if these truths were made public, it would tarnish the very fabric of English glory. Others believed that by revealing her final decline, they could finally reclaim their own humanity from beneath the weight of her long shadow. But none could deny what they had seen. One servant confessed years later that he would often wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, hearing her voice calling from behind closed doors, begging to be left alone, weeping like a child. Another claimed he had once passed her chamber and found her crouched in the corner, murmuring to a spot on the wall, tears streaking her white-painted face, her crown resting beside her on the floor like an abandoned relic. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, became part of the oral folklore surrounding Gloriana's end. It wasn't just death that haunted the palace, it was the spectacle of a monarch losing control. And for a nation raised to believe in divine right, in majesty without flaw, this image was more terrifying than any battlefield or plague. It suggested that power could corrode from within, that the same force which had lifted her above others had slowly hollowed her out, until only performance remained. And when even that failed her, what was left was not a queen but a frightened woman in a darkened room. The priests who had been summoned to perform the final rites spoke of a kind of spiritual resistance. Elizabeth, they said, would not receive communion, would not utter the prayers, would not allow the usual rituals of passage. Whether out of pride, fear, or confusion, she rejected the sacraments with the same stubbornness with which she had once rejected suitors and advisers. It was as though she intended to defy even God, or at least negotiate with him on her own terms. But to the clergy, this was not strength, it was spiritual peril. Some whispered that her soul was now restless, caught between this world and the next, neither damned nor saved, forever circling the place where her body had fallen. Meanwhile, James I settled into his throne with increasing discomfort. The shadow of Elizabeth loomed over every ceremony, every decree, every royal visit. He had inherited the crown, but not the reverence. Wherever he went, portraits of the Virgin Queen remained, their eyes seeming to judge him from the canvas, cold and eternal. He ordered some removed, replaced others with his own image, but the people did not forget. In fact, they clung to her memory more fiercely in her absence, casting her as the golden standard by which all others would be measured and found wanting. And so, Elizabeth's afterlife began not in heaven or hell, but in the collective psyche of a people who both revered and feared her. She became a kind of mythological creature, both divine and monstrous, a woman who had ruled with brilliance and brutality, who had loved no one and yet belonged to everyone, who had built an empire and died whispering to ghosts. Her story could not be tidied into a neat ending. It lingered, like the echo of footsteps down an empty hall. It bled through tapestries and court records, through paintings and plays, through the stones of the very palaces she once commanded. And in that lingering presence lay her truest power, not in the battles she won or the treaties she signed, but in the terror she left behind. The terror of a legacy that refused to fade. The terror of a woman who had become something more than human and something far more frightening. Alright folks, that's it for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching. The year is 1603, the setting, a grand palace. The mood, grave and reverent. Queen Elizabeth lies on her deathbed attended by her courtiers and doctors, and while they hover anxiously nearby, hoping to ease her suffering and hasten her demise, we are invited to stand outside the door, barred from witnessing her final moments. Why? Because the Queen has requested absolute privacy, and in this request, we see the first sign of mortality, the last vestige of autonomy in the face of inevitable oblivion. By shrouding her death in secrecy, Elizabeth denies her courtiers the spectacle they crave, robbing them of gossip that could later embellish their stories of glory. This is just the beginning. What follows is not merely a physical decline, but a dismantling of the very foundations of her glorious reign. As the Queen falls gravely ill, her physicians struggle to diagnose her ailment. Is it smallpox, measles, cancer, divine retribution? Each possibility fills the court with fresh anxieties, for each suggests a different future for England. If this is a mortal illness, then her replacement will be decided by bloodlines and birthright. But if God has judged the Queen, then chaos and uncertainty lie ahead. Adding to the dread, the Queen's symptoms defy easy categorization. Fever, chills, aches, convulsions, sores. These come and go without rhyme or reason, confounding the experts and terrifying the faithful. Elizabeth's behavior, too, grows increasingly erratic. She drifts in and out of consciousness, mixing half-remembered faces with phantoms of the past. Sometimes she seems close to recovery, rallying briefly before collapsing again. These false dawns of health are like hammer blows to her attendants, who cling to hope, then watch it dwindle with each relapse. Most disturbing, however, are her dark moods. Those times when she briefly regains her senses only to utter cryptic pronouncements that chill the hearts of her courtiers. "I have been troubled in my sleep," she murmurs one night, and an hour before day, my blood was all chilled. Are these prophetic dreams or premonitions of her own demise? Perhaps, but the courtiers cannot afford to dwell on such questions. Instead, they strain to hear every word, searching for guidance or a reassuring prophecy, anything to pierce the gloom. But the Queen offers no such solace, and in her maddening vagueness, she leaves them even more afraid of what might come. And then there's the matter of the Queen's food. How does a monarch go days without eating? How does a woman sustain herself on mere sips of milk and vinegar? The question torments her staff, who watch her waste away without appetite, growing weaker, thinner, more transparent by the hour. It's not merely her body that fails her, but the image she's so carefully crafted. Here is the Virgin Queen, shunning earthly pleasures, turning her back on suitors, denying her people an heir. Yet now this self-denial has tipped over into something desperate, something tragic. The virgin who swore never to marry has withered on the throne. Now her physicians try to feed her delicacies, roast meats, sweetmeats, exotic fruits, but nothing tempts her palate. Onlookers press closer, hoping for a miracle, a sudden craving that might signal recovery. But Elizabeth consumes nothing, subsisting instead on stale bread and the nectar of oblivion. As Elizabeth continues to waste away, the atmosphere at court reaches a fever pitch. Whispers turn to outright dread. The slightest cough, the faintest fever is cause for alarm. Every visitor departs immediately upon entering the Queen's chamber, fearing they'll be trapped inside forever. And once they're gone, the doors are bolted, the windows shuttered, for even light and air are considered too precious for the dying monarch. Those closest to Elizabeth grow desperate. Is there nothing, they ask, that can rouse her from this black lethargy? Nothing, comes the reply, except time. So they wait, watching, hoping, praying, but also terrified, for time is a double-edged sword. Time that heals, but also time that kills. And as the minutes stretch into hours, and hours into days, they know they're caught in a nightmare from which there is no waking. They await a verdict, one that will decide not only the fate of the Queen, but the fate of England itself. This is an original story set in the world of Shakespeare's plays. The court moved on, because it had to. James I held his coronation with measured pomp, the banners raised, the trumpets echoing through Westminster, but no ceremony could erase what the palace still remembered. Even in celebration, her shadow persisted, like a figure just beyond the curtain, watching silently as history bent itself into new shapes. The tapestries were replaced, the portraits rehung, but those who had stood in Elizabeth's presence knew that something vital had been lost, something no new monarch could replicate. James ruled, yes, but he did not haunt, and haunting, it seemed, had been Elizabeth's truest power. The fear she once instilled had not died, it had transmuted. It became awe, then myth, then unease. Even after her burial, rumors flourished that her death had not been natural, that perhaps she had chosen to die at that precise moment, as a final act of control, that perhaps she had willed her own end rather than allow the humiliation of weakness to persist one day longer. Some claimed she had summoned astrologers in her final nights, seeking a celestial time to vanish. Others believed her decline had been orchestrated by those who wanted her gone. Whispers of poison, of betrayal, of curses left unsaid. None of it could be proven. All of it lingered. But the most disturbing stories came from those who had attended her bedside. Those few allowed to see the Queen without her mask. One maid confessed, years later, that Elizabeth had spoken to her as if she were someone else entirely, calling her by the name of a long-dead sister, gripping her wrist so tightly that bruises bloomed. A gentleman of the Privy Chamber reported that in her final hours, she stared past him wide-eyed and whispered, "He is here now." When asked who, she would not respond, only silence, only stillness, and then the trembling. Whether these were hallucinations or true visitations, no one could say. But they became part of the legend, part of the legacy, for Elizabeth's story could never simply end, not cleanly, not peacefully. She had spent a lifetime wrapping herself in symbols, in prophecy, in ritual. Her death would be no different. It would carry the same weight, the same ambiguity, the same terror. The poets who later wrote of her death did not describe a gentle passing. They spoke of a soul wrested from the body, a light extinguished, not softly, but violently, a monarch dragged into the void by unseen hands. And whether metaphor or memory, those images stuck there became truth. Because the truth was not in documents or records, it was in the fear etched on the faces of those who had been there, the dread they refused to name. And outside the palace, among the people, something strange happened. Elizabeth, once so distant, so untouchable, became familiar in her death. Folktales grew from the soil of her story. She was said to visit the dreams of widows, to protect young girls from assault, to punish cruel husbands. Her spirit, they claimed, had not left England, but now wandered it more freely, more powerfully than ever before. A queen in life, a force in death. In one small village, mothers began telling their daughters, "Be strong, like the dead queen." In another, it was said that a shrine had been built in secret, a place where women knelt to ask Elizabeth's blessing for courage or revenge. The church, naturally, condemned these practices, but they could not stop them, because the people had seen something in her final days that no doctrine could explain. A monarch who faced the dark without armor, who embraced the terror. Others fled, and meanwhile the monarchy struggled to contain her legacy. James wanted peace, not phantoms, but peace was elusive when the past refused to stay buried. Elizabeth's funeral mask, made of wax, was stored away in a vault, but servants swore it wept. Her crown, passed on to the new king, was polished and reset with new gems, but still bore the weight of her touch. And every time James entered a hall where she had once ruled, there was a hush, a hesitation, as though the room remembered. Years turned to decades. Elizabeth became a chapter in history, but not a quiet one. Plays were written, portraits were commissioned. Her legend grew teeth, then wings. She was called the Virgin Queen, the Phoenix Queen, the last Tudor. But behind every title, every flourish of praise, there lurked the same image of a woman alone, refusing sleep, whispering to shadows, staring into the void. And still, no one could quite explain her final words, if she uttered any at all. Some claimed she uttered a blessing, others a warning. One account, half buried in a private letter, claimed she simply said, "I am not done," and then her eyes closed. No one knows if that account was true, but those 4 words, like a nail in old wood, refused to come loose. I am not done, not a farewell, not a prayer, but a statement, a promise, or perhaps a curse. You don't have to believe in ghosts to know that some places are haunted. There are photographs of Elizabeth's deathbed. They're grainy and yellowed, like the dying light of a candle flame. All right, these are the days of meticulous record-keeping. Everything is tracked and logged and indexed, especially when it comes to the royals. There should be no gaps in the narrative. And yet, in 1603, there is a lacuna in the official accounts of Queen Elizabeth's last illness. The primary source material for her final days simply ends. The entries stop. One moment, the Queen is recording her own DNB notes on a treaty, clear and present and in control. The next is chaos and hearsay, and a handful of increasingly lurid rumors, and then silence again. Officially, Elizabeth died of a fever brought on by blood poisoning. She fell ill after spraining her knee. Simple enough, yet whispers at the time pointed towards poison, a plot, a conspiracy, and those whispers persist to this day. Was it foul play or an accident or simply a quirk of fate that took the Iron Lady out? No one knows. And that is where the ghost story begins. It's not in the room where she died or the spot where she is buried or the paintings depicting her demise. It's in the blank page, the missing piece, the gap in the official narrative. What we do know is that, in her final days, she grew weaker and quieter and more forgetful. On March she wrote, "I am not well today," and signed it, "Your loving sister." 4 days later, the writing is messier, the spelling worse. She could not bring herself to write the full name of Robert Carey, so scribbled down his first name only, the Queen signing her own death warrant. On March, her secretary noted she was, quote, "out of order." For the rest of the month, he reported, she neither ate nor drank, only speaking twice. Once to ask for pen and ink, then once to say, "I am ready." Those 2 sentences are all we have from the last 24 hours of her life. The rest is a mystery. Was it pride or piety or pain that kept her from asking for food or water? Did she fast on purpose, choosing death over sustenance, death over submission? Some say yes, that Elizabeth starved herself, refusing the nourishment offered by her attendants. Others say no, that the Queen had lost her appetite, that dementia clouded her mind, and still others say yes and no, that Elizabeth both did and didn't starve herself, that she began to fast willingly, but grew weak and frightened enough to beg for water at the end, only to be denied. Either way, the official narrative ends here. No record of Elizabeth's death exists, only an unsigned account of her funeral. We know she was laid to rest on April 1603, that she was buried beside her sister Mary, and that a crowd estimated between 10 and 20,000 strong gathered to watch the procession. We know that her body lay in state in Westminster Hall, draped in black velvet, wearing jewels. We know that her coffin was carried aloft on the shoulders of 8 men, one for each of her counties, that her final journey was slow and deliberate and full of ritual, that she received a Christian burial. Yet no one knows what she looked like in death, whether her face was serene or contorted. No one knows what she wore under the velvet, or what treasures were placed in her grave, if any. No one knows if she was mourned or merely pitied, if she was missed or quietly cast out. No one knows what she looked like beneath a marble slab in Westminster Abbey or what she sounds like beneath the earth. No one knows because nothing remains of her death but silence,